So tonight at home when you're studying this, you're going to come up with your 2 study questions over here on the side where you write a question that would allow you to access something over here as the answer to the question. So one good question for this page might be, what is the definition of absolute value? And then another good question for this page could be something about the 2 solutions that you get on some of these graphs. What we're going to write down together today, though, before we turn the page, is I want to do the takeaway together. So a takeaway on your notes is 1 or 2 sentences that kind of sum up everything that you learned on the page. Think about a takeaway as being like a short summary. And so it doesn't have to be long like the normal summaries that you do usually are. A takeaway is just a short 1 sentence or 2 sentence picture of what it is that we learned on this page, but we're going to write it out in words. So if you take a moment and look back at what we learned about on this page, we said that absolute value is the distance that a number is away from 0. And then if you look at the examples that we did on the page, said a lot of times you can get 2 answers to the question. And so I think that a good summary would include both of those things. So absolute value is the distance a number is away from 0. And then I would also say something along the lines of, when you see absolute value bars, and so those are going to be bars like this that can be around a variable or they can be around a number as well. That means the equation can have up to 2 solutions. It can usually have up to 2 solutions. Notice that my takeaway doesn't say, today I learned about absolute value and there's 2. It's very specific about what it is that we learned about. It includes a definition, and then it includes 1 sentence about the rest of what we wrote on the page. I don't write down any of the examples down here in the takeaway. The examples are up on the page. The takeaway is just supposed to summarize it. And so reading this over would provide you kind of like a summary or a screenshot of what it is that we learned about on this page in the notes for today. So a good practice to get into is summarizing your notes because it helps you remember things. It aids in recall. So, all right. So you guys go on ahead and turn over to the second side on your notes. Remember, you're going to save this space over here so that you can go back and write 2 study questions later. What we're going to do right now on this part of the screen right here is we're going to do example number 2. And so example number 2, the directions for this question are going to say solve. And the rest of the notes for today are going to be spread over this page. So we're going to do an example A and an example B up here. And then we'll do C and D right around the middle of the page. So you won't need to cram your work together on this side. You can go on ahead and spread it out pretty comfortably. So when we solve these absolute value equations, you're thinking that there's a possibility that there could be 2 answers to the question. So example number 2, it says solve, and then here's A. A says the absolute value of 8x is equal to 24. So let's just take a minute and make sure we understand what this is saying before we move on. The absolute value of 8x equals 24 means that there's some number I can put in here for an x that would make this be 24 away from 0 in the positive direction. And there's some number that I can put in here for x that would make this be 24 away from x in the negative direction, or 24 away from 0, in the negative direction. And so when you're solving these, you want to consider that the 24 could go positive or the 24 could go negative. This is never going to come out of the absolute value bars as a negative number, but it could go 24 to the negative side, and so we want to make sure that we respect and understand that. So you guys, the way that you're going to solve these is like this. You're going to say that what's on the inside of this could be 24 away from x in the positive direction, and you're also going to say that what's on the inside of the bars could be 24 away from x in the negative direction. So look at what I did right here. There's no more bars around the 8. As soon as I make my 2 equations, I drop my bars and I just put whatever was on the inside of the bars on the left side of the equation, and then I put the positive and the negative of that number on the outside of the equation. I'm going to solve these equations separately like they were individual or by themselves. So on this one, when I divide both sides by 8 and divide both sides by 8, I'm going to get 2 answers to the question. And that's good because you know that when you do these, there are usually 2 ways that you can get answers to the questions. It's very common that you'll get 2 answers. So on this one, my solutions are x equals positive 3 and x equals negative 3. If I write them out like this, I'm not going to put a parentheses around them because this is not an ordered pair. But remember, you could also write it like this too, x equals plus or minus negative 3. You don't have to write it both of these ways. So let's put the word or in the middle. You just have to write it one of these ways. A lot of times you're going to see it written like this, so let's put the box around this one. But remember that these are both the same thing. If the directions also wanted you to graph your answer to this question, you're going to draw your number line. You're going to put the 0 in the middle. Here's positive 3, here's negative 3. And so this point is one answer, and this point is the other answer. You're not going to shade on the graph or do any arrows or anything like that because you're not finding a range of answers. You're just saying that one answer is right here and one answer is right here. And so this graph has 2 solutions. And the 2 solutions are indicated by those points that are on the graph. Before we move on to B, if you plugged in these numbers into the bars up here, you would find that both of them worked. If I plug in a 3, 8 times 3 is 24. The absolute value of 24 is 24. If I plug in a negative 3, 8 times negative 3 is negative 24. And then the absolute value of negative 24 is positive 24. And so it does work for both of them. Here's B. So on this one, the bars are still all by themselves, which means I'm ready to do the same step that I did over here. On this equation, it says that you're going to take 7 away from some number, and then it's going to wind up being 5 in the positive direction. And then when you take 7 away from some number, it's going to wind up being 5 in the negative direction. And so we want to figure out what 2 numbers would make that happen. So I'm going to say that the inside could be 5 in the positive direction. So there's my one equation. And then I'm also going to say that the inside could be 5 in the negative direction. So the negative on the 7s doesn't change, but the 5 here is positive, and then the 5 here is negative. When I add the 7 to both sides on this one, I'm going to get x equals 12. And when I add the 7 to both sides on this one, I'm going to get x equals 2. So on this one, notice that the 2 numbers are not plus or minus of the same thing. So I can't write the answer for this one this way. I can say that the answer to this question is 12 and 2. I could say that the answer to this question was 2 and 12. I could write 12 and 2. I could write 2 and 12. Just make sure that you don't put parentheses around them since it's not an ordered pair. And if you were going to graph these solutions on a number line, one of your answers is here at 2, and then the other answer is up here at 12. And so this one also has 2 solutions. So the more you practice these, the better you'll get. I think that's true about a lot of things in math. Make sure that you're showing all your work. Make sure that when you draw the 2 lines to solve the 2 equations, you're dropping the absolute value bars. So there's no bars here, there's no bars here, there's no bars here, there's no bars here. You want to remember that too. Just the more clear you can be with the work, the better you'll do to answer each question. So here we go. For the last 2 parts for this example, we're going to do an example C right here, and we'll do an example D right here. Example C is a little bit tricky. A lot of students have trouble with questions like this. So let's start with this one. It says the absolute value of x divided by 4 is equal to negative 6. Now, the question looks a little bit funny in general because we haven't done any that have division like this. But what's tricky about it isn't the fact that it's division. You're allowed to have division. It's totally fine. It just says that when you take x and divide it by 4, it'll be 2 directions from 0. And so that's totally regular and totally fine. What's different about this one, though, is that there's a negative sign right here. So on your notes for today, it would be helpful to go on ahead and circle this negative right here. The answer to this question is no solution. What's tricky is if you don't catch that negative right away, you might end up getting 2 fake answers to the question. So a lot of students would do this question and get positive 24 and negative 24 as their 2 answers, but that's not true because the absolute value can never come out of the bars and equal a negative value. Absolute value can never come out of the bars and be equal to a negative number. This question is entirely different if there was a negative out in front of this bars, but that's what we're going to look at tomorrow or in the next day's lesson. If there was a negative out in front of here, it would change everything because you would have to get rid of that negative first. But in this case, something divided by 4 can never be negative 6 away from something, and so we say that this equation has no solution. So you do want to keep your eyes out for any time where you see bars equal a negative because that will always be no solution. For D, the question says negative 3 minus 5x is equal to positive 2. So this question has negatives in it, but they're inside the bars, and that's fine. You can have negatives on the inside. You just can't have the bars equals a negative. So this question is a regular question, and I'm going to proceed with solving it the same way I did with these questions that were up above. So I'm going to take what's inside the bars and set it equal to positive of this number, and then I'm going to take what's inside the bars and set it equal to negative of this number. So I'll go through and I'll follow that solving practice. So it's going to equal positive, and then it's going to equal negative. And I'm using 2 because 2 is the number that's right here. So when you go through and solve both of these, carefully making sure that you follow the process of finding the answers to the questions, you should get 2 answers to the question. Negative 2 plus 3 gives me positive 1. And then just make sure over here when you're solving this one, when I divide both sides by negative 5, this is not going to give me negative 5. A lot of students forget to see that the 1 is in the top and then 5 is in the bottom. The negative 5 is in the bottom. So this is going to stay a fraction. When you write the answer on your paper, you can keep it written as a fraction as well. It's not wrong to turn it into a decimal, negative 0.2, if you wanted to turn it into a decimal. So those two things are equivalent, but most students will just choose to keep it as a fraction. So for this one, the 2 answers to the questions are negative 1 and negative 1 over 5. And again, you could write that as negative 0.2. So if the directions were asking me to also graph this, I could put these solutions on a number line. So let's see. If 0 is in the middle and if negative 1 is right here, then one of my answers to the questions is negative 1, and then the other answer to the question would be right here or around right here at negative 1/5. And so those would be my 2 solutions that are answers to that question. So that gives you kind of the solving process for this. So a takeaway for this page, just to wrap up, would be one sentence that describes, or 1 to 2 sentences that describe what we learned on this side of the page. So this side of the page was different than the front because on this side we were actually going through and solving things. I think that a good takeaway for this side of the page would talk about how you solve these equations. We didn't write any definitions on this side of the page, but we could write 1 to 2 sentences about how these get solved. So for my takeaway for this side, I think that something like this would be good. If the absolute value bars are already isolated, and already isolated means that they're already by themselves. So there's no number in front of them, there's no number behind them, etc. You split off the 2 equations. You drop the bars, and don't forget that step because a lot of people forget that. And you solve each equation to find your 2 solutions. And I put the word 2 right here in parentheses because it is possible that sometimes you might just get 1 solution and sometimes you might get no solutions. And so you want to make sure that you're being mindful and keeping your eye out about that. So looking over the notes for today, make sure that you remember that part of your homework tonight is to come up with 2 study questions for this side of the notes, and then you'll also come back to the front and you'll come up with 2 study questions for this side of the notes as well. The study questions are a great thing to do to test yourself right before you take the test to make sure that you understood what we learned about in class. It's a great way to study to prepare for things like that. You can also anticipate that making study questions also helps you when you go home, because when you go home before you start your homework, you should make sure that you take a careful look at these notes so that you can review the notes before you start working on your homework as well.